Well, it's 1 o'clock, but we'll give it a couple more minutes for some other people to join us. I'm Phil Woolery, Purdue Extension here in Stark and Pulaski counties. We are, so just introduction on the format of this. If you haven't been one of these, we're gonna ask you to keep yourselves muted. Questions will go into the chat. You can see that at the bottom of the screen, bring that up. And then we'll, at an appropriate time, I'll get those questions to Bob and we can answer them. I'm recording this for later use, and I'll send everyone a link to the recording. So if you want, you can come back later and watch it again. At the end, we'll deal with credits for CCA credits, and also if you have a commercial applicator's license. So this is after one. Bob, you want to get started?
Well, yeah, we're all, I laugh because while I've been doing a lot of Zoom meetings over the last almost 2 months now, it's still not the most comfortable venue for me. I'll be the first to admit it. I told Phil and the others that I don't have necessarily a canned presentation to go through. But I've just got some things I want to visit with you about, and we'll see how it goes. I look off to my side every once in a while because I've got a second laptop up and running, which is serving as my sort of visual monitor, so that I know for sure that when I think I'm showing you something, I'll look off to the side and know for sure that it's up. So it's a different world for us in Extension. It's a different world for everybody because of this COVID-19 business. I'm Bob Nielsen. I'm the Extension Corn Specialist at Purdue. My email address is on the screen. Don't hesitate to send me emails about this program today, or really anything that comes along in terms of corn. If you're on Twitter, my Twitter handle is also on the screen, so you can follow me if you want there. I'm not a particularly big fan of Twitter myself, but I do use it to send out, particularly when I'm out in the fields and I come across some stress, some plant problem that I think might be interesting to people. I tweet that out. And then usually when I write a newsletter article on something, I'll usually tweet that out too. So anyway, there are a couple of ways that you can get a hold of me today. So they're certainly there for you to work with. So I want to show you just some background information on the resources that are out there on the web in case you're not familiar with it. Well, that's okay. Yeah, there we go. So if you're not familiar with the Chat and Chew Cafe website of mine, it's there for you. Let me see if I can quick add. Bear with me. I'm sort of doing stuff on the fly. Let me see if I can add that quick. Okay, so there's the address for you in case you can't read that fine print at the top. But anyway, the Chat and Chew is a website I've had for quite some time. It began its life as a place where I aggregated links to newsletter articles from all over the Midwest. It's been modified over the years, and now let me get my mouse where I want it to be. Okay, and so now you can get to these other newsletter articles in this blue boxed list of people. And so there's Illinois, there's Iowa State, there's Kansas State, and you can see the states that are listed there. If you click on any of them, let me just click on Iowa State as an example. It'll take you to Iowa State's newsletter site, and so you can see what they're saying. And you can do that for any of these universities that are listed there. Over here on the right, there's also a calendar event where if you click on a month, it'll pop up and show you some of the educational events that I'm aware of, both in Indiana and in nearby states. So just be aware that you've got that there if you're looking for calendar things to do. Over on the right side are a list of what I simply call handy resources. And so, for example, this second one, Applied Research in Field Crop Pathology. Well, okay, it opens up a PDF. I'm not going to bore you with that. Let me find something else. Okay, so this corn GDD estimation tool, that will take you to this page that allows you to keep track of growing degree days from quite a few states, actually. But in any of these states, you can take it down to a county level and get fairly up-to-date temperature records and this and that. And again, I don't want to bore you on those details at this point in time. The final thing I want to point out is this Corny News Compendium. And so, you know, I've written an awful lot of newsletter articles over the past 20-some years. A lot of them have nice pictures with them. And so this is sort of my archive of all the articles I've done. And at the top of the page are the ones that are relatively recent. So, for example, leading up to that big frost event that we had, I had put out this piece called Assessing Frost and Cold Temperature Injury to Young Corn. And so that's the news article I did that talked about how to assess it, and it had some pictures in there. And when you click on a picture, it pops it up into a somewhat bigger picture. So again, the only point I want to make at this particular time is that this Corny News Compendium is a place where you can get at essentially all the newsletter articles that I've done in recent years, but also going back quite some time. So that's really all I want to say at that point. So let me sort of move on and just talk a little bit about this year. This is a graph of the planting progress in Indiana. This year's progress are the red squares connected by the red line. The dashed blue line to the right of this year is the 10-year average. Last year, the slowest or among the slowest planting seasons we have ever had is off to the right, that nice dark blue line. And then a few other years in recent history are there also. So, excuse me. So as of Monday's report, you know, we're about 71% planted across the state. I've been somewhat impressed that the progress per week has remained pretty constant now for 4 or 5 weeks, and we've been gaining at around 20% planting per week for some time. I suspect next Monday's report will probably be quite a bit different, because I can't imagine there's a tremendous amount of planting still being done this week, given the rain that a lot of the state has incurred. But you know, we're certainly off to a fast start this year, and of course that led to some of the fears about that frost event that we had earlier in May, and we'll talk about that here a little bit later. The soybean planting progress shows pretty much the same story, and let me see if I can stretch that out a little bit. You know, certainly we are way ahead of last year's planting progress on soybeans. Monday's report, we're somewhere in the mid-50s for percentages planted across the state. We're ahead of the 10-year average, and we're trailing the 2019 or 2018 planting progress a little bit. But for both crops, it's certainly been a much better start to the planting this year, even though temperatures have frankly not been conducive very often since we began planting both of these crops. And we can talk a little bit more about that here in a bit too, if you want. So let me then just move into an example that I think most of you have already seen yourself by now, but let's say maybe a little reminder of how corn can recover from from late frost and freeze damage early in the spring. And this is an example from the agronomy farm, and it involves some plants that I flagged and tracked as they were damaged by the freeze and how they came out of it. This is a graph of the air temperature data from the agronomy farm beginning the day before the freeze event through the following 9 days. And at the agronomy farm, that morning of the 9th, temperatures dropped just under 25 degrees for at least 1 hour's recording. But what was also interesting was there were 7 hours of temperatures below 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So the 7 hours below 32 degrees were troubling by themselves, but the fact that the low temperature actually dropped as low as 25 degrees was certainly cause for alarm. And these kind of temperatures are pretty common across the central and northern parts of the state, and I know there were areas that got even colder than that, and areas that had even more hours of temperatures below 32 degrees. So clearly this was a concern, because while we didn't have a tremendous number of acres planted or emerged at that point, there were enough acres out there that were vulnerable that it certainly led to some concern about what the consequences would be. Now, one thing I was worried about was soil temperature for corn. And I'll talk a little bit about the differences between corn and soybean here in a bit. But for corn, I think you all realize that the growing point area of that corn plant, or sometimes we call it the meristem, that remains below ground until about the 4th or 5th leaf collar. It's located just above the crown of the plant, and I've got a picture coming up here that'll make that a little more clear. But as long as that growing point is below the soil surface, any damage to the plant tissue above ground tends to be primarily cosmetic damage. It has no lingering effect on the plant, as long as that growing point remains undamaged. So my concern leading up to this May 9th freeze event, and knowing what the forecast low air temperatures were going to be, was this question of how low would the soil temperatures get. And I was concerned with a 25-degree air temperature forecast that perhaps that temperature, say in the upper inch or upper 2 inches, may drop below 30 degrees. And that potentially would cause some damage to that growing point. So I was really concerned about that. This graph is showing the soil temperatures at 4 inches. The 4-inch depth is what's commonly measured by meteorological weather stations. Don't ask me why. There's some history to it, I suppose, as to why they use 4-inch and not the depths that you and I work with. But nevertheless, it's what we have. And so at the agronomy farm on the morning of the 9th, the lowest soil temperature recorded was only 45 degrees. Jim Beatty, who's the superintendent out at the agronomy farm, he went out with his just manual soil probe, and that morning around 6 o'clock or 6:30, and even at the 1-inch depth at the agronomy farm, the lowest soil temperature, or the soil temperature at that lowest point, was only 38 degrees. So with that knowledge in hand, I felt a much better that there would not be any dramatic or severe effect in terms of killing plants due to this frost and freeze event. But I wasn't sure around the state if maybe there would be areas, say in the mucks or on dry sands or something, where maybe it would drop that low. I was still a little concerned about that, but the good news was that on our heavier soils, it was pretty clear we weren't going to get down to those lethal temperatures. Let me back up to this air temperature chart, and I don't have a good way of using my mouse or being able to highlight stuff for you, so you sort of have to visually follow where I want you to look at. But if you look at the air temperatures following the freeze, and so on Saturday itself, the temperature recovered up to, maybe 58 degrees. On Sunday the 10th, it was maybe in the mid 50s for a high. On Monday the 11th, temperatures were only around 50 degrees. All right, so that's Saturday and Sunday and Monday of temperatures that simply were pretty darn cool. This has an impact on how fast corn will show you that it's recovering, because when it's that cool, corn simply doesn't develop very fast. When these things happen, I normally say, well, give it about 3 days and go out and take a look at the field, and you should see some recovery from the whirl. Well, that's assuming temperatures are decent. And so with the rest of Saturday and Sunday and Monday being so cool, it was pretty clear to me that come Monday, we weren't going to be seeing much evidence of any recovery or death, because it's simply been too cool. The forecast that week was for it to start warming up, and indeed this graph shows us that as we get into the 13th and into the 14th and into the 15th, we finally got above 60 degrees. And so with that kind of a forecast, I knew that by the end of the week, we might be able to see some visual evidence as to whether fields were recovering or not. So let me just show you sort of a sequence using one of these plants that I marked. And so this is one of the plants. It was in a field at the agronomy farm that was planted on April 7th. And of course, this was May 8th, so a month later. And these plants were a strong V1 or one leaf collar plant, and we're approaching V2. So just a brief reminder in growth staging on this young plant, that leaf on the left, which is the so-called thumb leaf, it's shaped somewhat like a thumb. In the shadow, if you look really close, you can see the leaf collar. The leaf on the right, which is also big, in fact, it's larger, it's longer than the thumb leaf. But if you look really, really closely, you'll see there is no visible leaf collar. So technically, this plant is still a V1. In practice, I would say it's a late V1, and by the following day, it probably would have been V2, right? Bottom line is it was a V1 or V2 plant is what we were looking at. And this was 1 month after planting. This was Friday afternoon, the afternoon before the Saturday freeze, and so this is what this plant looked like. The following morning, again, the temperatures dropped to 25 degrees around 6:30 or so. I was out there at 10 a.m., and this same plant, you could already begin to see the damage done by a combination of frost to sort of collapse or melt, if you will. There's sort of a water soaking appearance to them. And so less than 4 hours after the lowest temperature and the frost, these plants were already beginning to show the effects. So this was Saturday, 10 a.m., less than 4 hours after the coolest temperature. By that evening, this same plant had changed appearance 180 degrees. Chlorophyll was essentially totally gone. The plant was continuing to collapse or melt down. I sometimes chuckle when we use words like melt down or toast or fried when we're talking about a cold weather event. But nevertheless, the plant is slowly collapsing to the soil surface, and so certainly does not look good. By the following Monday, and again, now we had a cool Saturday, a cool Sunday, and a cool Monday. By the following Monday afternoon, this same plant sort of looks the same. Worse, even more. The leaves have they bleached out even more. And maybe most importantly, when you look at the base of the plant, there is no evidence of recovery whatsoever. And this is what people were seeing all around the state was, 2 or 3 days after the frost, they were out looking at fields, and the entire blessed field looked like this plant. And so it's pretty easy for the untrained eye to say, well, this field is toast. I'm going to be replanting because there's certainly no evidence of recovery. And I say to the untrained eye because if you've had enough experience over the years looking at the consequences of these frost freeze events and understanding that corn needs warm weather to develop, frankly, this is what I expected to see that Monday afternoon because the conditions had not been good for recovery. The air temperatures on Saturday morning were truly lethal. So anything exposed to them above ground, it's gone. All right, it's dead. And so the key thing at this point, about 3 days later, is now to start looking at the growing points. And let me see. Well, that's just a picture of frost. You've all seen that before. So on a similar plant nearby, I dug up and looked at the growing point area. So on this young plant, again, this is the Monday after the freeze. On this young plant, there at the crown of the plant where the first permanent roots are beginning to elongate. First of all, you can't tell, but I'll tell you that this area was firm. It wasn't beginning to turn to mush. It was firm tissue. The yellow-white kind of color that you see is what I would expect to see on a young seedling like that. The mesocotyl, which is that part beneath the crown connecting to the seed, was firm. It was white. It was healthy. The seed itself was still healthy. The seed roots were healthy. And so 3 days after this very serious, lethal above-ground air temperature, the below-ground important parts, the growing stem or the meristem area, was healthy. And so this again tells me that, okay, it didn't die. I mean, after 3 days, it would have been turning to mush if it was going to die. And so now this is telling me it was that the response of the corn plant was going to be simply a response to the above ground damage. And again, corn can respond, recover very nicely from above ground damage. The other quick point I'd make on this slide, and I indicate that this crown area where the growing point is located, it resides only about 3/4 inch below the soil surface. It doesn't matter how deep you plant, the crown's going to end up at about 3/4 inch below the soil surface. And this is why I was concerned leading up to that freeze event. The concern was, whether the cold temperatures would penetrate that 3/4 inch. Thankfully, it didn't. And so at this point, a couple days later, the crown was still looking good. I did not get out the rest of that week, partly because it was rainy and muddy, and I probably had other things to do. I don't know. But the following Monday, right? So 7 days after this, all right? So I came back 7 days after this and looked at the same plants. And this is what they looked like 7 days after my last visit or 9 days after the freeze event, all right? So 180 degrees difference, right, on what the plant looks like, all right? Now we see almost nothing but green plant tissue. We see the remnants of the 2 leaves that were exposed on the day of the freeze, right? You see them pasted to the soil surface. There's a dead leaf sort of coming out to the front. That's the #1 thumb leaf. If you look closely, you'll see a dead leaf going out the other direction, sort of towards the back side of the plant, pasted to the ground. That's the #2 leaf. And then if you look close at the how do I say it? The first green leaf that we now see, and look at the tip of it, you'll see the damage, the dead tissue or the missing tissue at the tip of that leaf. That was the tip that was exposed on the day that it froze. The rest of that leaf that's green was protected below ground still and was undamaged. All right, so let me just brief show you the whole field, and then I'll come back to this picture, right? So this is the whole field. 7 days earlier, to the untrained eye, you would have said the field was gone, it was toast, it was ready to replant. With patience and a return to warm weather, the plants tell you how they're doing, all right? The plants will always talk to you. They'll always tell you if they're recovering or not. And so, with this kind of a view in mind, there's simply no way on earth that you would consider replanting this kind of a field. And that's the problem with these freeze events, is that it takes a lot of patience to not pull the trigger too soon. Because if you were looking at fields like this on that Monday following the frost, and if you said, hey, it's gone, I need to replant, and there's a forecast of rain coming in on Wednesday or Thursday, you're probably going to get your butt out in the field with a planter and start replanting. And then maybe not on this day, but over another couple of weeks, you'd still have a field that looks nice and green like this, but you'd probably have double the number of plants in the field. You'd be looking at 6,000 plants per acre. So again, we always got to be careful with knee-jerk replant reactions to something like a freeze event, because this crop can recover from an amazing amount of above ground damage early in the season as long as that growing point remains undamaged. And so this collage simply puts everything back in perspective, how on the 8th of May, they were halfway decent V1, V2 plants, and by the evening of that Saturday, they were starting to melt away. By Monday, for all intents and purposes, they looked dead. And then 1 week after that, things were hunky-dory, and the crop continues, all right? And so that's sort of my brief overview of the frost freeze events. And from conversations with others around the state, my sense is that the overwhelming majority of the fields that were emerged on that Saturday morning probably got through this freeze event in pretty good shape. Again, just a reminder, this is my letter that talks about how to assess damage from freeze and frost. And it's on that Corny News Compendium site that I mentioned to you early on. And so, keep in mind for the future that, for these kinds of, I'll say, not necessarily oddball kind of weather events, but for poor growing conditions in general and damage events, keep in mind, if you go to my Corny News Compendium, I've been here long enough, I've seen enough, chances are I've got a newsletter article somewhere on that Corny News Compendium that's going to talk about it. So just, remember you've got that resource available to you for that kind of thing. With that, Phil, I don't if there's some questions that have come up, we can certainly stop and talk about that at this point. Is there any questions that have come up?
Not yet. If you have any questions about what we've been talking about, put them in the chat below.
Yeah. Well, while they're thinking about that, let me just say a little bit about the effect of flooding and ponding on corn prior to tasseling, because there are areas, not necessarily just Northwest Indiana, because there's other areas in our state also that receive some, not just tremendous rainfall, but rainfall occurring in a really short period of time. So there are areas around the state with some pretty serious ponding or simply saturated soils. And there will be areas along the rivers that are going to outright flood over the coming days as all this water comes down the river system. So contrary to thinking about the effects of frost or freeze on young corn plants, where because that growing remains below the soil surface, I generally don't get too excited about frost events because I know the crop can recover. But when it comes to ponding or saturated soils, obviously that's a whole different ballgame, because that all-important growing point is below the soil surface. And so it's vulnerable to the effects of saturated soil conditions and ponding. So, people often ask, well, how many days can a ponded field or a saturated field survive until it dies? And my sort of cheeky, flippant answer is it'll survive until it dies. And that's about all you can say. Is it varies by soil texture, it varies by hybrid, it varies by temperature. The cooler it is, the longer it'll survive ponding. The warmer it is, the faster it's going to die. So again, it falls into this category of you just got to wait and see, and wait until that water resides, wait till the saturated soils return to field capacity or better. and then just watch the plants. And they'll tell you if they're going to recover or not. But having said all that, I have to say that in contrast to the fear-mongering about the freeze event, for those areas that have received this heavy rainfall and have experienced the ponding and the saturation, I think there's a far greater risk of damage to the field and the possibility for the need to replant on these recent rainfall events than there is on that earlier freeze events. So keep that in mind. Let me go back to and just one more thing in case there's no questions coming in. Last week, Darcy Telenko, our plant pathologist, and I, we put out this fear-mongering about seedling blight. And the concern here, and I'd have to say that I haven't seen it yet myself, but the concern is for this corn that's been in the field since first week in April, second week in April, third week in April by now, those fields have been in the ground for somewhere between 3, 4, 5, almost 6 weeks. The seed treatments that we use on corn for fungicides and disease prevention, those seed treatments only last maybe 3 weeks at best. They just deteriorate naturally over time. And when we have early planting in general, or when it's been cooler than normal after planting for as many days and weeks as we've experienced, it has several consequences. One is it takes forever and a year for that crop to germinate and emerge. So corn, the few fields that were planted the first and second week of April, most of those fields easily took 3 weeks to emerge. Fields that were planted, say, the third and fourth week in April, they still experienced quite a bit of cool weather, so even they took quite a bit of time, at least 2 weeks, if not longer, to emerge. And so, for example, the field that I began showing you on the freeze event, the field I was following at the Grummy farm, it was planted April 7th, and on May 8th, the day before the freeze, it was only at the V1, V2 stage. Let me go back to... all right, go back to this, all right? So this was the root system on these plants that had been planted a month earlier. The first permanent roots, those are what we see coming from the crown area. They're not very long, and frankly, they're not long enough to really be doing much for the at that point. If a plant at this age develops disease in the mesocotyl or the seed, before these permanent roots have become well established, such young plants, they're gone. They're going to die. They're going to be gone. So the day that this freeze hit at the agronomy farm, this field was already vulnerable to the onset of seedling blights. And that's why Darcy and I put out this article sort of fear-mongering about seedling blight, because I still think there's a risk for many of these early planted fields that are still maybe V2 or V3, and it's been a month since they've been planted. With the kind of wet weather that we've had, the warmer weather also we've begun to get, I think there's a real risk for some of these fields for the development of seedling blight. And if you've ever seen this develop before, you realize and recognize how fast this kind of a disease can just take out big areas of fields or entire fields. So sort of a long, drawn-out bottom line to all this is we've had a lot of crap hit these fields. The good news is we've been planting at a much better pace than we were last year. And, of course, last year the big news was delayed planting. The good news is we've been off to a way better start, probably almost as good a start as we've had in a long time. That's good news. The bad news is it's been cool. This crop has been developing at a snail's pace, and it's been hit by all sorts of stuff. It's been hit by the freeze. Some's been hit by the heavy rainfall and the ponding. Some may get hit with a seedling blight. So just, I guess the bottom line I'm trying to get to is that a lot of these fields deserve a lot of attention in terms of field scouting over the next few weeks. just to document whether or not there's going to be problems developing or whether they're going to continue to develop fine and get those initial roots established and get to that stage in pretty good shape. So anyway, honestly, these are the things that I thought I would share with you today. I'll take it back to my full video screen. I guess only other thing that would come to mind is if you've been in areas with these heavy rains in the past, say, week or so, up until that point, we weren't too concerned about nitrogen loss because it'd been a reasonably dry winter and a reasonably dry early spring. But with the kind of rainfall that some areas got in the past 7 days, there's going to be a real risk for two possible ways of losing nitrogen. On the sandier soils with this much rain, it's going to move a lot of that nitrogen pretty far down into the profile, possibly all the way down into the groundwater. On the heavier soils, it's not leaching we worry about. It's this other process that we call denitrification, and that results in nitrogen loss back out to the air, back out to the atmosphere. So those fields with all the heavy rains and the saturated conditions that some of these fields have had, there will be some nitrogen loss in those fields. We can assess that loss to a certain degree by doing soil sampling prior to side dress. In this situation, you'd probably want to ask for both nitrate sampling and also ammonium sampling, especially if you've put on nitrogen this spring, because some of it may still be in the ammonium form. And so you want to be sampling for both. And again, on my newsletter, my Corny News Compendium site, in the soil fertility section, you'll find an article that talks about using soil samples to assess for that. So take a look at that. So with that, I'll just lean back in my chair and twiddle my thumbs and wait for questions. And if there aren't any, it'll be a quick, fast session to be done with. So any questions? And Phil, maybe we can open up mics at this point if they're not comfortable chatting and they just want to speak out. So.
Yeah, I think that will work. If you have questions for Bob, you can unmute yourself and ask away.
Any thoughts on sulfur? Does the rain impact that at all?
Sulfur will move down on sandier soils like nitrogen will, but it does not have the similar denitrification or anything similar to that kind of process on the heavier soils. So it would be the sandier soils that we would worry about sulfur moving down. And so depends how far it moves down in terms of the consequence on the plant. The corn plants, as young as they are and as shallow as the root systems are, it doesn't take much movement of the sulfur that will get below those root systems. And so they may develop sulfur deficiency symptoms, which may be temporary in the sense that if the roots eventually find the sulfur as they keep growing down, then they'll come out of it. So there could be some short-term sulfur deficiency symptoms that show up, but again, on heavier soils, you wouldn't expect near the movement downward as you do in the sandier soils.
Yeah, Bob, Marty Park here. Just a couple comments. We saw tremendous recovery in this frosted/frozen corn. I think our issue in Northwest Indiana now is just the heavy rain. Unfortunately, we're just not drying out. We keep getting these little drizzly things and no sunshine, and just doesn't seem like the water's getting away very fast. So my experience has always been that like seedling blight's been more in the wet areas, not where we've been pretty dry. But it seems like it's always worse there. So a lot of times you'll have your drowned out spot, and then on the edge of that, you'll lose more to seedling blight on the outside edges. So just other than that, we were off to the races looking really good, except slow. So now we got to wait this one out and see what Mother Nature gives us as far as the potential to even get in a reap.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I was thinking this morning, another day waking up to cloudy weather, and I was thinking I should have gone back to the weather records to document how many cloudy days have we had over the past 60, and it's got to be a phenomenal number. So, yeah, the crop desperately needs sunshine, it needs warmth, and it needs at least moderate rainfall, but certainly not excessive. And so it's going to continue to struggle until we get a return to these growing conditions. So again, I think it really behooves people to be out scouting these fields on a fairly regular basis just to document, are there problems developing or not.
I know in Stark County, I got out and saw a little bit. I didn't see we might not have got as cold as you did down in Lafayette. I think our recorded at the airport was 27 or 28 degrees. But one cornfield I walked on the Monday, it was, I saw just a handful of plants that just had the tips damaged. And the low spots, I think, were they weren't up yet. So, with the cooler air, they weren't emerged from the ground yet in those spots. The higher, sandier spots, they didn't look pretty, but a week later, and they're fine. So,
Right. And yeah, I'm not the soybean guy, but let me just show you, again, you've probably seen these kind of images, but let me just show you, let's see if I can share that screen. Yeah, so, yeah, I don't know why my king corn is on that screen, but, certainly soybeans, simply because they're a different beast in the sense that their growing point does not remain below ground. As soon as it emerges, it's vulnerable to this kind of above ground stress. And so let me go through this. So, here's an example of, let me back up. So, at least in fields around here, there wasn't much beyond this unifoliate stage on the day of the freeze. But, here's an example where the unifoliates are dead and big damage to the coleoptile. There's two plants, if you can squeeze your eyes and look hard, but there's two plants that, the unifoliates are dead, the cotyledons are dead, everything above ground is dead. And of course, on a soybean plant, when that happens, there's no opportunity for recovery. If you look close at this seedling, okay, I guess you can barely see my mouse. Or where my mouse is pointing, that would be an axillary meristem associated with this cotyledon. So, from a soybean perspective, the whole key is when you're scouting if these cotyledons are healthy, chances are these axillary meristems at the cotyledons are healthy. And so even if everything was killed above that, those two axillary meristems would lead to two branches, and you'd be okay. Whereas a plant like this, there's just nothing left, right? The cotyledons are dead, the stem is dead. I mean, there's just nothing left. So I think for beans that were emerged, there was a far greater consequence in many cases to those fields than they were for corn.
Well, we heard the weather forecast. It's supposed to the 90 days. There's a slight chance of above normal temperatures and a better chance of above normal moisture. Would that be making you feel at ease if that happens, going into pollination time frame down the road?
Yeah, I think at this point, it's so far out, I don't think I could begin to speculate on what impact it may have by the time this crop gets to tasseling. But this weekend's forecast, or maybe it's early next week, of close to 90 for several days, at least the Lafayette forecast. Fields, if there are fields that remain saturated going into those kind of 90-degree days, those plants they're going to die. I mean, those temperatures are so warm, and if those fields are still saturated, it's going to be really tough on those plants. So again, more crap just keeps sort of coming and hitting the fan, and we go from one extreme to the other, both in temperature, both in rainfall. And I sort of keep thinking how ironic we're off to a really good start planting, and yet we're still struggling with this crop, and we still feel bad about this crop by and large because so many things. So I think at this point it's just going to be a constant struggle and a constant need to pay attention to what's going on in these fields. And there may still be needs to replant down the road. Crop prices being what I think, Marty, maybe you and I were chatting about this earlier in the week, that crop prices being what they are, some guys may decide to prevent plant instead of going in and replant some of these fields, because the prospects for net income or gross income this fall just not going to be good at all. So all of this stuff's just coming together, and so many different things that are impacting decisions at the moment that it's making it really hard to figure out what's the right agronomic decision that's going to make the best economic sense. So.
Here's a question. With such a challenging year last year, what were some key things that you learned from last year's growing season?
Well, the first thing I'd say is what I have preached for years, and that is planting date by itself doesn't mean much. And we saw this over and over and over again last year. Corn planted the first week in April, yielding 200 bushel, 210 bushel, 220 bushel an acre. Now, granted, not everywhere, but again, one of the key things we were reminded last year is that when we get into the kind of delayed planting that we had last year, it is not an automatic kiss of death, and we shouldn't get too bent out of shape, because it's the rest of the season that dictates, what that crop is going to do. So I think that's one key lesson that we should have relearned last year. I think another lesson from last year, which is often a annual kind of problem, and that is the consequences of soil compaction. And of course, last year there was so few days that were fit to be working ground or planting fields, and so there was an awful lot of soil compaction created by tillage, created by the planter. And then in those areas of the state where it turned off dry later on, we certainly saw the consequences of that stunted root system due to the compaction. So, a reminder that while we cannot always avoid compacting soils with our field work and planting, we do sometimes have opportunities to wait a day or two before we do anything. And I think it's always fair to say that when we have those opportunities to avoid compacting soil, we need to take it, because with this year-to-year weather becoming more erratic and full of extremes, we never know, is it going to go from wet weather like we've had to 5 weeks. We saw a little bit of that last year where the rain just shut off in areas for weeks on end, and those fields that were compacted, the corn rolled up tight way sooner than it should have based on the rain. So again, I think the evils of compaction were certainly a lesson that should have been relearned. Off the top of my head, I think those are probably two of the things that I have pretty tried to forget most of last year. So for some of those lessons. I will make maybe one request in a way. Given this nasty COVID business that we're all dealing with, one of the consequences to us at Purdue is that we're going to be a little more restricted on travel. Not so much travel per se, but our well, let's just say they're asking us to cut back on our travel, to cut back on expenses. So, bottom line is, I don't foresee myself being able to get out as often and frequent as I usually do during the summer because of that. So, in order for me to do some timely newsletter articles, I need to be aware of what's going on around the state. So, please feel free to contact me Marty, I really thank you this week for, I had no idea some of those heavy rainfalls had occurred. And so I really appreciate that, hearing that from you, because I just hadn't heard that. So, if things are happening in your area of the state that you think really deserve a good newsletter article or some kind of a reference to help people, let me know, please. And I would really appreciate that, because otherwise I'm just afraid I'm going to be operating a little bit in the dark this summer, just because of some of the travel restrictions we're under here at Purdue. So I'll just make it and ask you to do that for me if you would.
So does anyone have any more questions for Bob? All right, so now we'll get into, I'd like to thank Bob for coming on and doing this, trying this new format to try and get you some knowledge and answer your questions about what's happening with the corn crop. So if you have a commercial applicator's license, we can get you some credit for this program. So you can put that in the chat or send me an email. So you have my email address because I sent you the link to the recording. So send me your name and license number. And I will get the stuff up for if you have your CCA license or certified crop advisor as well. Here, get that up. So here's the information for that. And if you have problems with that, you don't want to do the smartphone thing, I guess you can send me your name and license number as well, and we can get that entered that way, I believe. So thanks everyone for coming. I don't come in, you stayed in your office, but for logging on today and participating. Next week we'll have Darcy Talenko, and she's going to talk about maybe some of these seedling diseases we've been seeing, and I think talk about the potential for tar spot, some of the new research that they've been doing about this new disease and what to look for and what are some ways to either avoid or treat it. So,
and Phil, let me just also
Yep.
thank people for their patience with this new way of communicating. It's, I think we're better than we've been in the past few years when we've tried to do this occasionally, but it's certainly a new way to communicate, and maybe more importantly, a new way to educate. And we're still trying to figure out how to make this be somewhat close to being there in real life person. So thanks for being with us, and thanks for hanging in for this 50 minutes or so.